And we're back. We're going to get into a roundtable and reader mail segments of the podcast. Before we get to what you guys and gals have been sending in, we're going to do a roundtable in which we actually decided to not pick one person's, but combine the two because they touched on similar topics. Both Gita and I sort of submitted two things that seemed pretty interesting and had some overlap. And then you would check out this Chris Ware piece about Minecraft that was in the New Yorker recently. It was on the cover of the New Yorker. We'll have that in the show notes so you can read that if you want. It's a really good piece. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's great.
And it's, again, like to speak to Minecraft is on the cover of the New Yorker. So it's on T-shirts at Target and the cover of the New Yorker. It is spanned the spectrum. But yeah, so there's two essays we're going to kind of have some overlap with. Gita, do you want to maybe introduce yours? And then, because they both kind of come at a similar topic from opposite viewpoints.
Yeah, so I read today a blog post from Michael Salmon? I don't know. Sure. Michael from Tale of Tales.
Sure.
And I read it and was just very frustrated by it. One, just because it was it was weird to read this blog post in 2015 as opposed to 1995. Like, it's a very 1995 viewpoint on games culture and video games. It's called Violence Begets Violence. And he starts off talking about a game that Tale of Tales made, which was sort of a peaceful, nonviolent MMO, and then contrasting that with games that feature violent mechanics at the forefront. And saying that not only do we know now that violent games promote violent behavior, which is actually a very common misinterpretation of studies about video games and violence. It isn't that my ex-boyfriend, who now has a PhD, congratulations to my ex-boyfriend, who might or may not be listening to this. Congratulations. But he has read these studies, and he said, well, it doesn't actually say that violent games promotes violent behavior. It says that people who are already aggressive have aggressive behavior normalized by violent mechanics in games just because aggression is rewarded in those games. And then, like, in the last paragraph, what I found very weird to read as like a middle person from a middle-class family that could be described as an intellectual is his call to quote probably middle class, probably intellectuals to like educate the gamer masses on the error of their ways.
We'll just read this. I think game developers as creative people, probably middle class, probably intellectuals, which there's a lot of assumptions in that first line, which is already getting yourself into hot water. Underestimate how unstable some members of their audience are, how isolated they live, how little access they have to education and broader culture, how little context to place these games in that are so important to their sense of self. We could help these people with entertainment that demonstrates the beauty of life, the value of nonviolent interactions, how much better it feels to care than to hurt, how big and diverse the world is, and so on. A game developer who claims to be a peaceful, tolerant person while producing mass murder simulators is a hypocrite. I will not accuse him of being directly responsible for mass shootings and online harassment, even though you're kind of... but they are beyond a doubt guilty of neglecting to prevent such things, which is just...
He seems like a frustrated dude. I mean, this is also coming off of the Tale of Tales closure blog post, right?
Yeah.
They've got a lot of anger and resentment inside them. And I get it, but also, one, writing mass murder simulators into 2015 is like, dude, like, where have you been in a bunker?
Like, not every game is hatred and postal, right? Like, lots of games include... the murder and killing as a
shooting mechanics
as a mechanic, but to just
he does. Minecraft was on the cover of the New Yorker. Like, for being real, the games that are actually
the game that's like changing the world is Minecraft, and to get focused on it's very myopic to get very focused on Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed. Not to say those games aren't popular or that don't have an impact culturally, or even to say that games don't have an impact on how we think and feel and our attitudes, because that would be to lessen what games are as culture and as art. But it's also whoa, let's pump the brakes a little bit. Especially I think it says too much and maybe too little about what games are capable of or are doing, and then also the effect they have on people, right? Like, I think to say, if you want to take the subtext of this, a lot of what's in this blog post is that, like, Gamergate is a byproduct of, like, violent video games and, like, catering to certain, like, gamer culture and creating certain identities. And it is not to say that games aren't participatory in creating certain parts of culture and creating certain identities, but I think this maybe puts way too much of an onus in some ways on games and says too much about what they're actually doing to people in the world.
I think
and it seems under-researched as well. Like he's using probably a lot and maybe a lot in ways that are like his attempts to save face because he's not citing actual sources.
And it's also in this way that I find I myself doing and other sort of games critics and writers doing. It's like the video game culture blinders are on. Like, the people that I continually try to think about when I write now, because I know there's a subset of people who play games that really just aren't interested in my work, and that's 100% fine. They don't have to read my stuff if they don't want to. But there's, like, a huge population of people that don't read games websites because they think there's no content on there for them. And they play games, like, literally every day. Like, to get so angry about violent video games is to hyper-focus on people who self-identify as gamers, who have bought into the sort of corporate construction of this identity. When, in fact, like, pretty much everybody plays a game on a daily basis. Even if you're just playing an iPhone game on the bus.
Right. Still playing games.
Yeah.
Still playing games. You're still, in some ways, a gamer. And that... when you remember that, you understand, like, oh my God, this world is so big, and there's so many other things to pay attention to other than, like, the Destiny update, because it's really a small percentage of gamers that actually play Destiny.
Well, I think this. You also see feelings like this in the games media. Oh, one thing I do want to mention before I go further is that I said mass murder, and it was just murder simulators. So I want to make sure that we point out exactly what the blog post was
just regular kind of murder instead of like
I just wanted to make sure being accurate, but you see a lot of think pieces like this. The media is super guilty of this. I'm guilty of, like, tweeting about this and things like that, where after E3, which is like a hyper concentrated dose of a lot of this stuff, right? Because these are predominantly the games that get the billing at E3. I think this, E3 2015 was a year that was more balanced than most. It's always going to be. It is always. Nothing is going to change. I doubt things will change 100 years from now. Violence will still be sort of the central, like, predominant, like, forward-facing mechanic, and, like, because it's bombastic and it's appealing in that way.
People like action movies.
Exactly. Like, that's going to be a primal thing that games continue to harp on. But they're like, E3 2015 had, like, The Last Guardian and Shenmue and, like, that weird Dreams game from Media Molecule. Like, there was lots of weird, interesting stuff on display, and this just feels like a direct response to just like, well, but so many of those games had people stabbing dudes and dudettes, and it's right. It's not wrong, but I think in 2015, there's so much more going on with games that you're also not giving games enough credit for. This also still feels a little bit like resentment over, like, gamers let us down over
definitely.
Our game not selling well. Like, it feels like this is an extension of that.
Because he begins, like, with an anecdote about his own game, like the first game that Tale of Tales made, this Endless Forest game. And this is a classic example to relate it back to, like, teaching experience that I have. Like, when you're in front of 30 kids and you're feeling frustrated and there's kids who are not following directions, like, you have two sort of options. One is to, like, negatively frame what you're seeing or positively frame what you're seeing. And if you negatively frame what you're saying, you call out the kids that are doing things that are wrong. So you're like, like, Phillips, sit down, like, put your hands to yourself, whatever. But, like, the studies show that, like, the way to actually get your classroom back on track is to positively frame, to shout out the people that are doing it right.
Yes.
And I think that this is an opportunity for him to actually, instead of just shouting out himself and his team and then talking about in very general, like, under-researched terms, like, what's wrong with the gaming industry, like, to actually shout out plenty of game makers who are doing the kinds of things that Tale of Tales is also doing, which is thinking very critically about, making game mechanics that promote certain positive social behaviors. And I think that's a really noble thing. Like, I think what he's trying to say is really, like, aligned with what I believe and is kind of noble. But he's just doing it in a really negative. Like, it's a bad look.
You could have, like, you can look at what was written there extract like a way less aggressive thesis statement, and then have spent 800 words like, here are 5 games that I think are doing this.
Doing it right.
And
there are more than 5. You know what I mean? That's what's so ridiculous. It's like he could totally do that, and it would feel so generous.
And
it would feel like a totally different post.
Go support these games, share these games, like that. Just, again, like I think as we've said, it feels like a byproduct of frustration that is understandable, right?
Yeah.
Like, I know, Gita, you wrote about this recently, about like sort of understanding failure and like the process of failing and going through failure, and that it's, especially in these days where we're very public facing with a lot of outlets, you may go through that ugly process in a public way, which we didn't necessarily do in the past.
And it's not productive, I think. Maybe like grab a drink with your friends and bitch to them, but like the whole world doesn't have to know about it.
It's not a blog post that then gets talked about on a podcast.
Exactly. I did like tweet about this landlord that totally fucked me over, but then I looked back at it like an hour later and I was like, you know what? That was immature.
Right.
I should delete this because he just didn't really speak enough English to understand what a freelancer is. And that's what happened. What do you do? I work from home. Okay.
I got it.
Yeah, that's what happened.
But I think, it's, it may be, and it may not be that, Tale of Tales, a month from now looks back on that stuff and goes like, oh, like we had these feelings as a part of the process of understanding what happened and how we feel about the industry.
Yeah.
But then to be public about those feelings while you're going through it, you can look back on that stuff and go, it's just like growing up, right? Like everything we do, like, I'm not sure how you feel about this, Gita, but like I look back on everything I wrote before today and go, all of it garbage.
Yep, 100%. That's how I feel about everything. Sometimes I'll read something and be
there's a couple of things I look back like,
pretty okay.
I did pretty good. Like, there's a handful of stuff I'm like, no, I nailed that. Like, we're cool.
That one's pretty
like,
chill.
Not total garbage, like half garbage.
I remember the professor, Brett Kashmir, he did a screening of his movie about Canadian national identity and hockey culture.
Valerie's Ankle. It's on Vimeo if you want to look it up.
It's a great, if you're interested in hockey culture, hockey violence, or Canadian national identity, I'd recommend watching. It's fantastic. But he did a screening of it, and we went out for drinks afterward, and like on the way to the FEV, he was just sort of like, I can't believe I used the phrase dialectic in my movie. And like I was watching it and I was like, holy shit, this movie is so good. But like literally, everything you do in the past seems like a worse thing than you could be doing now because you've lived and grown from those experiences.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So the other essay that I had, and we won't go into it too much because we've covered most of the stuff and brought it up in our own arguments, but Raph Koster, who was one of the lead designers on Ultima Online, was the chief architect of Star Wars Galaxies, like a guy that is like worked specifically in spaces in which there's social spaces where you see like the games you make are like meant to, like people are supposed to live in these places in a lot of ways, and he has just a really interesting perspective on a lot of stuff, having made games that specifically speak to that. So like he kind of starts off his thing with the topic of his blog post is called Games Affecting People. And he says, this comes up especially in relation to questions about free speech. It comes up in terms of working with the compulsion loops some might term addictive. It comes in terms of whether or not game designers worry about what they do. The most common answer is no, likely because it's an uncomfortable question people would rather not think about, or one that positions games as somehow an implicitly risky medium and vulnerable to censorship, or because of a disclaimer of responsibility embodied in the notion that we're just providing entertainment and anything past that is the player's problem. Sometimes there's an implicit idea that mere entertainment cannot have any effect. So do designers worry? Yes, I have personally. And he goes into the things he did worry about, which was like, when people use social spaces to like fill gaps in their lives. Like maybe they are lonely, and like so they use MMOs as a way of filling that. So he's like, well, it's not necessarily a bad thing that someone has an empty void that they filled through the game, but how can I make that void a more positive experience, right? Like how can I design, like if I know this about my players, just because they're spending hundreds of hours here that maybe other people might misconstrue as unhealthy, like if this is their outlet, if this is where they're learning about themselves and want to spend time, how can I make that a better experience for them? Like, how can I make it more positive? And like, that's, I feel like that's a much more healthy way to look at how mechanics interact with players.
I think it really understands the sort of psychological studies that have been done on video games more than the Michael from Tale of Tales piece. because it understands that games don't create behaviors out of a void. They encourage or discourage behaviors that are already within a person. So like a lonely person who plays an MMO to fill their social life, like they might learn things about social interaction via an MMO based on assumptions they already have about interaction. So they might become a harsher person if the game space they're playing in is more harsh, and it's better to create an environment for them that is more welcoming and nicer, because hopefully those behaviors will be reproduced in real life.
It's the same thing, like, Anita Sarkeesian talks a lot, and people conflate this a lot, I think, like when she talks about, like, games that include sexism don't make sexist people, but it can reinforce sexist ideas and norms and things you learn in broader society, and that's like a responsibility for creators, is to think about that your one thing, it exists in a broader pool. So it's, not one experience is guilty. It's like broad guilt across the board, but you add all that stuff together, and that's what creates culture. That's what creates norms. That's what, that's how all that stuff adds together. And I think that all kind of feeds into this general idea that we've been talking about. But we will link to both of those in the show notes, and we'll also have Sam's in there as well, which is that really cool piece on Minecraft in the New Yorker.